The most dangerous mistake is not arresting the wrong person, it is believing you already know who they are. On a cool Monday morning in downtown Washington, D.C., commuters flowed across the sidewalks with the quiet rhythm of another ordinary workday. Government employees hurried toward federal buildings with steaming coffee cups in hand, attorneys crossed intersections carrying leather briefcases, and tourists paused to admire the marble architecture that symbolized the promise of justice. Nothing about the morning suggested that thousands of assumptions were about to collide with a single unexpected truth. Standing near the entrance of a federal office complex was Naomi Carter, a 35-year-old black woman dressed in an elegant navy business suit. She carried no visible signs of authority beyond a slim leather portfolio resting comfortably against her side. Her expression remained calm, her posture relaxed, and her attention appeared fixed on the people moving around her. To anyone passing by, she looked like another professional beginning a busy day in the nation's capital. Across the street, Officer Daniel Mercer stepped out of his patrol vehicle after receiving information from dispatch regarding a person matching a reported description in the immediate area. Mercer had served on the force for more than 15 years. His fellow officers respected his confidence, his paperwork was consistently thorough, and he believed experience had taught him to recognize suspicious situations before they developed into larger problems. As he observed Naomi from a distance, small details seemed to align with the information he had just received. Without hesitation, he began walking toward her with measured confidence, convinced he was simply performing another routine responsibility. Nearby pedestrians gradually slowed their pace, their curiosity quietly pulling their attention toward the unfolding interaction. Naomi noticed the approaching officer long before he reached her. She neither turned away nor appeared surprised. Instead, she waited patiently with the same composed expression she had carried all morning. When Officer Mercer politely addressed her and requested identification, Naomi acknowledged him respectfully, maintaining steady eye contact without displaying frustration or fear. Every movement suggested remarkable self-control, almost as though she had expected this conversation before it even began. The surrounding crowd instinctively assumed the officer understood something they did not. After all, uniforms often carried an unspoken authority that discouraged questions before answers. A few people discreetly lifted their phones, not to interfere but to document what they believed might become another ordinary police encounter. Office workers whispered among themselves. A security guard watched from the building entrance. Traffic continued rolling through nearby intersections while the city remained unaware that 7 minutes would soon become one of the most significant measurements of the entire story. Officer Mercer calmly explained that Naomi would need to accompany officers while they verified certain information connected to the report. She listened without interrupting, offered no resistance, and responded with remarkable courtesy. Her composure puzzled even the officers standing beside Mercer. Most people confronted by unexpected legal questions displayed confusion, anxiety, or frustration. Naomi displayed none of those emotions. She simply looked around the busy street one final time, almost as though silently memorizing every face present, before agreeing to cooperate completely. No one watching could understand why she remained so calm. They believed they were witnessing the beginning of a routine investigation. In reality, they were standing only moments away from discovering that first impressions can become the most convincing witnesses against the truth. The ride to the courthouse lasted less than 15 minutes, yet the atmosphere inside the vehicle felt strangely detached from the busy streets outside. Officer Daniel Mercer reviewed routine information on the in-car computer while another officer quietly confirmed dispatch updates over the radio. Everything sounded ordinary. The reported description appeared to match. The location aligned with the original call. Every procedural step seemed consistent with a standard investigation. To Mercer, the situation was already beginning to close itself before it had truly begun. Across from him, Naomi Carter sat with remarkable composure, her leather portfolio resting neatly beside her. She answered each question politely, providing only the information that was requested and never volunteering additional details. Her voice remained steady, her breathing calm, and her expression unchanged. It was not the confidence of someone trying to challenge authority. It was the confidence of someone who understood that time often revealed more than arguments ever could. At the courthouse, attorneys hurried between hearing rooms while clerks organized stacks of legal files and deputies directed visitors through security checkpoints. The building carried the familiar rhythm of American justice, where dozens of unrelated cases unfolded simultaneously beneath high ceilings and polished marble hallways. For everyone working there, another hearing simply meant another name added to an already full schedule. Naomi's appearance drew little attention as she entered the courtroom. Several spectators quietly assumed she was another defendant waiting for a routine hearing. Their conclusions formed almost instantly, built entirely upon appearances rather than facts. Officer Mercer greeted the prosecutor with professional confidence before reviewing the initial incident report once again. Every line appeared complete. Every observation seemed reasonable. The prosecutor nodded with quiet satisfaction, believing the hearing would move quickly without unexpected complications. Even the courtroom staff prepared the file with the efficiency that comes from years of routine procedure. Meanwhile, Naomi accepted every instruction without complaint. She remained respectful toward court personnel, thanked a clerk who directed her to her assigned seat, and waited patiently while documents were organized before the hearing officially began. Her behavior puzzled a few observers. One elderly spectator leaned toward another and quietly remarked that most people facing legal uncertainty appeared nervous long before entering a courtroom. Naomi simply sat with perfect posture, occasionally glancing toward the courtroom doors as though expecting someone who had not yet arrived. Judge Eleanor Whitaker entered promptly, and the courtroom immediately settled into respectful silence. After the preliminary formalities concluded, Officer Mercer calmly described the sequence of events exactly as he remembered them. His testimony sounded organized, measured, and entirely believable. Every answer reflected years of experience, and nothing in his demeanor suggested uncertainty. Members of the gallery exchanged subtle nods, convinced that the officer had acted responsibly from beginning to end. Naomi listened carefully without interrupting a single statement. She neither challenged the testimony nor displayed visible frustration. Instead, she quietly observed every person speaking, occasionally making brief notes on a small legal pad provided by the court. Even the judge noticed her unusual composure. It was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of someone waiting for the proper moment rather than the quickest one. As the hearing continued, the prosecutor confidently presented the incident as a straightforward matter supported by eyewitness observations and procedural documentation. Everything appeared to favor the government's position. Yet just beyond the closed courtroom doors, footsteps echoed through the marble corridor as an unfamiliar group carrying sealed federal folders approached with calm purpose, completely unknown to everyone already seated inside. The courtroom settled into an even deeper silence as the prosecutor concluded the first phase of the presentation with quiet confidence. Every document appeared properly organized, every timeline seemed consistent, and every witness statement pointed toward the same conclusion. Officer Daniel Mercer remained composed in the witness chair, convinced that the hearing was progressing exactly as expected. Years of experience had taught him that orderly cases rarely change direction once the official record began to take shape. Around the room, jurors carefully followed each statement while spectators exchanged subtle glances that reflected quiet agreement with the testimony they had heard. To nearly everyone present, the outcome already appeared predictable. Naomi Carter remained seated with the same remarkable calm that had puzzled the courtroom since her arrival. She never interrupted the proceedings, never reacted emotionally to assumptions being made about her, and never attempted to draw attention to herself. Instead, she occasionally glanced toward the courtroom entrance before returning her focus to the judge with complete patience. Judge Eleanor Whitaker noticed the pattern. Most defendants watched the witnesses. Naomi seemed far more interested in the doorway than in the testimony itself. The observation lingered in the judge's mind, although she offered no comment. She simply continued reviewing the documents placed before her while carefully observing every person inside the courtroom. Then something unexpected happened. A deputy quietly approached the bench carrying a small note that had just arrived from courthouse security. Judge Whitaker read the message without changing her expression, although her eyes remained fixed on the paper a moment longer than anyone expected. She looked toward the courtroom entrance before calmly nodding to the deputy. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet several experienced attorneys immediately sensed that something unusual had interrupted an otherwise routine hearing. Officer Mercer noticed the brief conversation but assumed it involved another case waiting outside. The prosecutor continued organizing legal files without concern. Meanwhile, Naomi's expression remained exactly the same. She neither smiled nor displayed relief. It was almost as though she had anticipated the interruption long before anyone else realized its significance. Outside the courtroom doors, 3 professionally dressed individuals waited quietly with courthouse security. Each carried a slim black portfolio secured with official federal seals. They spoke softly among themselves, presenting identification that caused the security officers to immediately contact court administration. No raised voices could be heard. No urgency disturbed the hallway. Everything unfolded with remarkable professionalism, yet the seriousness of the visitors was impossible to overlook. Inside the courtroom, the hearing resumed. Officer Mercer answered another series of questions regarding his observations during the initial encounter. His testimony remained detailed, organized, and consistent with the written report submitted earlier that morning. The prosecutor thanked him before preparing to introduce additional supporting documentation. Just as another exhibit was about to be entered into the record, a quiet knock echoed through the courtroom. Every head turned toward the entrance. The deputy opened the door slightly before approaching the bench once again. Judge Whittaker listened carefully as several words were spoken too softly for anyone else to hear. This time she looked directly toward Naomi Carter. Their eyes met for only a brief moment, yet the silent exchange carried an unusual weight that no one else in the room could explain. After several thoughtful seconds, Judge Whittaker addressed the courtroom in her usual measured tone. She announced that the proceedings would pause briefly to allow the court to review newly arrived federal documentation connected to the matter before them. Confused whispers immediately spread across the gallery. Officer Mercer exchanged a puzzled glance with the prosecutor. Naomi simply folded her hands together, quietly waiting as the heavy courtroom doors slowly opened and the first visitor carrying a sealed federal folder stepped inside. The courtroom remained unusually quiet as the 3 visitors entered with measured confidence, their polished shoes echoing softly across the marble floor. None of them displayed urgency, yet every movement carried the unmistakable discipline of experienced federal professionals. The individual leading the group introduced himself only to the courtroom deputy before presenting official identification along with a sealed folder marked for immediate judicial review. Judge Eleanor Whittaker accepted the documents without comment and carefully examined the federal certification attached to the outside envelope. The courtroom watched in complete silence. Officer Daniel Mercer sat upright in the witness chair, attempting to understand why an ordinary hearing had suddenly attracted the attention of federal officials. The prosecutor quietly reviewed the case file once again, searching for any obvious explanation that might justify the unexpected interruption. Nothing immediately stood out. Meanwhile, Naomi Carter remained exactly as she had been since the beginning of the hearing. Her posture never changed. Her breathing remained steady. She neither acknowledged the arriving officials nor attempted to draw attention to herself. It was as though she understood that the documents would speak long before she ever needed to. Judge Whittaker slowly opened the sealed envelope and removed several professionally organized folders. She carefully compared the certification numbers attached to each page before reading the accompanying letter in complete silence. As the seconds passed, her expression remained professional, yet her concentration became noticeably deeper. She turned one page, then another, occasionally pausing to compare information between multiple documents. Finally, she looked toward the lead federal representative. He offered a respectful nod, confirming that the materials had been delivered through proper legal channels and were ready for judicial review. Without revealing the contents, Judge Whittaker requested that the documents be temporarily entered under seal while the court verified their authenticity. The courtroom clerk immediately recorded the request. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Spectators who had expected a routine hearing now leaned forward with quiet curiosity. Even the jurors exchanged brief glances, sensing that the proceeding had entered unfamiliar territory. Officer Mercer maintained his professional composure, yet he could not ignore the growing uncertainty spreading throughout the room. The prosecutor politely requested clarification regarding the nature of the federal submission, but Judge Whittaker explained that preliminary verification would occur before any public discussion. The response only deepened everyone's curiosity. During the brief administrative review, the lead federal representative remained standing near the counsel table, speaking only when addressed by the court. His calm professionalism reflected complete confidence in the documentation he had delivered. Naomi continued waiting silently, never interrupting the process and never attempting to influence the court's review. Her patience seemed almost extraordinary, as though every minute unfolding inside the courtroom had already been anticipated long before the hearing began. After several careful minutes, Judge Whittaker closed the final folder and folded her hands thoughtfully upon the bench. She looked first toward the federal representative, then toward the prosecutor, and finally toward Naomi Carter. The sequence did not go unnoticed. Every person inside the courtroom instinctively followed the judge's gaze. The silence became almost impossible to ignore. Then Judge Whittaker spoke with deliberate precision, informing everyone that the court had confirmed the authenticity of the newly submitted federal documentation and that the information contained within it possessed direct relevance to the matter currently before the court. She announced that before testimony could continue, one essential issue now required immediate clarification. Turning toward Naomi, the judge asked in a calm and measured voice, "Ms. Carter, before this court proceeds any further, would you please state your official federal position for the record?" The question seemed to suspend time itself, and every eye in the courtroom turned toward the woman who had remained quietly patient from the very beginning. For several long seconds, no one inside the courtroom moved. The silence carried more weight than any testimony that had been presented that morning. Naomi Carter slowly rose from her seat with the same calm confidence she had displayed since the moment Officer Daniel Mercer first approached her outside the federal building. She adjusted the sleeve of her navy business suit, looked respectfully toward Judge Eleanor Whittaker, and spoke in a steady voice that carried effortlessly throughout the courtroom. "Your Honor, my name is Naomi Carter. I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words seemed almost too simple for the effect they produced. Every face in the courtroom changed at once. Jurors exchanged astonished glances. Reporters immediately reached for their notebooks. Several spectators leaned forward as though they had misheard what had just been said. Even the courtroom clerk briefly paused before continuing the official record. Officer Mercer remained perfectly still. His confident expression slowly gave way to quiet disbelief as he looked from Naomi to the federal representative standing only a few feet away. The prosecutor carefully lowered the folder that had been resting in his hands, realizing the hearing had entered an entirely different legal landscape than the one he had prepared for earlier that morning. Judge Whittaker maintained her professional composure. She turned toward the lead federal representative and requested formal verification for the record. Without hesitation, the representative stepped forward, presented official credentials, and confirmed under oath that Naomi Carter was indeed an active special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation assigned to an authorized federal operation. He then provided the court with additional certification documents bearing official authentication numbers that matched the records already reviewed by the judge. Judge Whittaker examined each document carefully before handing them to the courtroom clerk for entry into the sealed record. Every procedural step unfolded deliberately, leaving no room for uncertainty. The confirmation did not create excitement through raised voices or dramatic reactions. Instead, it produced something even more powerful. The assumptions that had quietly shaped the entire morning began dissolving one by one beneath verified facts. Officer Mercer searched his own memory, replaying every moment of the encounter outside the federal building. Naomi had never argued with him. She had never challenged his authority. She had never attempted to reveal information that might interfere with legal procedure. She had simply cooperated with complete professionalism from beginning to end. The realization settled heavily across the courtroom. Judge Whittaker addressed Naomi once more, asking whether there had been a specific reason she had chosen not to identify herself earlier. Naomi answered with the same calm respect that had defined every word she had spoken throughout the hearing. She explained that federal operational protocol required her assignment to remain confidential until judicial authorization permitted formal disclosure through the appropriate legal process. Personal explanations outside that process could have compromised an ongoing federal matter as well as the integrity of future proceedings. The explanation was clear, measured, and entirely procedural. The lead federal representative confirmed the statement without hesitation, noting that the court had now reached the authorized point for official disclosure. Around the courtroom, the emotional atmosphere quietly transformed. What had begun as confidence in appearances gradually became respect for procedure, patience, and verified evidence. Judge Whittaker looked across the room before speaking carefully into the official record. She stated that the court recognized Naomi Carter's verified federal status and that all subsequent proceedings would continue with full consideration of the newly authenticated information. As those words echoed through the courtroom, everyone present understood that the hearing had crossed an invisible line. From that moment forward, the central question was no longer who Naomi Carter was. The real question had become why an active Federal Bureau of Investigation special agent had quietly allowed the entire legal process to unfold exactly as it had. No one spoke immediately after the court acknowledged Naomi Carter's federal credentials. The silence that settled across the courtroom no longer reflected uncertainty. It reflected careful reconsideration. Judge Eleanor Whittaker instructed the courtroom clerk to temporarily suspend the original sequence of testimony while the newly authenticated federal materials were incorporated into the official record. The lead Federal Bureau of Investigation representative stepped forward and placed several certified folders on the evidence table. Each document carried matching authentication numbers, official departmental seals, and chain of custody certifications confirming that the records had been preserved according to federal standards. The judge reviewed the accompanying certification before authorizing the documents to be marked for judicial examination. The courtroom projector displayed the first timeline as attorneys, jurors, and spectators quietly focused their attention on the screen. Instead of dramatic accusations, the federal presentation relied entirely upon dates, recorded communications, location logs, and documented procedures. Every page was introduced with deliberate precision. Naomi remained standing beside her counsel table without interruption, allowing the official records to speak for themselves. Officer Daniel Mercer watched the presentation carefully, recognizing several routine reports that he himself had previously completed. At first glance, each document appeared familiar. However, as the federal timeline expanded minute by minute, subtle details that had once seemed insignificant began forming a larger picture. Dispatch records showed the exact time the initial description had been transmitted. Building access records documented Naomi's authorized presence near the federal office complex. Security camera timestamps confirmed the sequence of ordinary movements observed outside the building. None of the information appeared sensational. Instead, every record quietly reinforced another, creating an increasingly complete reconstruction of the morning's events. The prosecutor studied the evidence with growing concentration, occasionally comparing the federal timeline with the original incident report already entered into the court record. Judge Whittaker noticed several small differences in timing that deserved careful examination. They were not dramatic contradictions. They were measured inconsistencies that required clarification before any legal conclusion could be reached. Rather than making assumptions, the judge asked that each discrepancy be reviewed individually through certified documentation. The courtroom appreciated the disciplined pace. This was not a contest between competing opinions. It had become an exercise in verifying facts through reliable evidence. Naomi continued answering every procedural question respectfully whenever the court requested clarification. She explained that her assignment required strict adherence to operational confidentiality and that every action she had taken that morning had followed established federal guidelines. The lead federal representative confirmed her explanation by referencing internal authorization records already submitted under seal. Every response remained professional, concise, and supported by documentation. Officer Mercer listened closely. For the first time since the hearing had begun, he appeared less focused on defending earlier assumptions and more focused on understanding the complete sequence of events. His attention shifted repeatedly between the federal records, the courtroom display, and his own written report. Around the courtroom, the atmosphere transformed from quiet certainty into thoughtful reflection. Jurors took detailed notes. Reporters stopped searching for dramatic headlines and instead concentrated on accurately recording the evolving testimony. Even spectators seemed to recognize that the most important moments inside a courtroom often arrived without raised voices or emotional confrontation. Judge Whittaker concluded the afternoon session by noting that the court's responsibility was not to preserve first impressions but to examine verified evidence wherever it led. She scheduled the next phase of testimony to continue immediately after the certified records had been fully compared with every statement already entered into the official record. As the courtroom prepared for the next stage, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The case was no longer moving according to assumptions formed outside the courthouse. From that point forward, every conclusion would rise or fall upon documented facts alone. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt noticeably different from the one that had existed only an hour earlier. No one seemed interested in rushing toward conclusions anymore. Judge Eleanor Whittaker reminded every person present that assumptions carried no legal weight unless they were supported by verified facts, and she instructed both parties that every statement moving forward would be measured against the certified federal record now before the court. The courtroom projector illuminated another sequence of timelines, placing the original incident report beside dispatch communications, security access records, surveillance timestamps, and official federal documentation. Each minute of the morning was reconstructed with remarkable precision. Naomi Carter remained composed, observing the presentation without interruption. She understood that careful documentation often spoke more clearly than lengthy explanations. Officer Daniel Mercer watched the comparison unfold with complete attention. The timeline began with the original dispatch call and continued through each documented event that followed. The first comparison appeared minor. A recorded communication from dispatch indicated that additional verification had been requested before officers finalized their assessment of the reported description. The request had been transmitted only moments after the initial notification. Judge Whittaker asked that the communication be replayed from the certified audio archive. The courtroom listened quietly as the recording confirmed that dispatch had indeed advised responding officers to continue verification because the available description remained incomplete. The prosecutor reviewed the transcript before acknowledging that the communication accurately matched the certified recording. No accusation followed. Instead, the court simply added another verified fact to the growing timeline. The next document displayed building security records showing Naomi's authorized access near the federal office complex during the exact period referenced in the incident report. Those records aligned perfectly with federal authorization logs previously admitted under seal. Again, there was no dramatic confrontation. The evidence simply fit together with increasing consistency. Officer Mercer carefully compared the displayed timestamps with his own written report. He appeared thoughtful as he reread portions of his original narrative. Recognizing that several assumptions made during the initial encounter had been based upon information that was still being verified at the time. Judge Whittaker noticed his careful review and thanked him for taking the process seriously. She reminded the courtroom that responsible justice depended upon correcting incomplete understanding whenever better evidence became available. Naomi answered several additional procedural questions regarding her assignment. She explained that her operational instructions required limited disclosure until judicial authorization permitted official confirmation, and that every action she had taken had followed federal guidance designed to protect both ongoing investigations and the integrity of legal proceedings. The lead Federal Bureau of Investigation representative confirmed each point through certified operational records without revealing confidential investigative details beyond those authorized by the court. The jurors listened carefully, taking detailed notes while comparing every certified exhibit introduced during the hearing. The spectators who had once quietly accepted the earliest version of events now watched with a different perspective. They were no longer observing a simple legal dispute. They were witnessing how careful review could transform understanding one verified document at a time. Even the reporters adjusted the language in their notes, replacing earlier assumptions with precise descriptions supported by the official record. Judge Whittaker eventually summarized the progress made during the afternoon. She observed that the certified evidence had established a far more complete sequence of events than the court possessed at the beginning of the hearing and emphasized that fairness required every conclusion to reflect the entire factual record rather than isolated impressions. As the final exhibit of the day was entered into evidence, a quiet sense of clarity settled across the courtroom. The facts had not shouted. They had not demanded attention. They had simply remained patient until every assumption finally yielded to the truth. By the time the court reconvened, the atmosphere had changed so completely that even the smallest sound seemed unusually clear. The quiet conversations that had once filled the gallery had disappeared, replaced by careful attention from every person inside the courtroom. Judge Eleanor Whittaker looked across the room before reminding everyone that justice was never measured by how quickly a conclusion was reached but by how faithfully every fact was examined. She explained that the certified federal records, the testimony already presented, and the official court documents now formed a complete foundation upon which the court could proceed fairly. The prosecutor acknowledged that the newly authenticated evidence had significantly expanded the factual record and requested permission to revise portions of the original presentation so that every statement accurately reflected the information now available. Judge Whittaker approved the request without hesitation, noting that the willingness to correct the record demonstrated respect for the legal process rather than weakness. Officer Daniel Mercer remained attentive as the updated timeline was reviewed one final time. Every communication, every documented observation, every verified timestamp, and every certified authorization now appeared together in chronological order. The complete sequence revealed that the events outside the federal building had unfolded within a far more complex legal context than anyone inside the courtroom had originally understood. Mercer quietly acknowledged that his initial decisions had been based upon the information available to him at that moment and that later documentation provided a broader picture than he had possessed during the encounter. Judge Whittaker thanked him for answering with professionalism and reminded the courtroom that the purpose of judicial review was not to preserve incomplete conclusions but to ensure that complete evidence guided every legal determination. Naomi Carter continued to display the same calm dignity that had defined her conduct from the beginning of the hearing. She answered each final procedural question directly and respectfully, never allowing emotion to replace precision. The lead Federal Bureau of Investigation representative confirmed that Naomi had remained fully compliant with operational protocol throughout the entire sequence of events and that the timing of her identity disclosure had followed established federal requirements approved through proper legal authority. The certified documentation supporting those procedures was formally accepted into the record without objection. Jurors carefully reviewed their notes one final time before returning their attention to the bench. The spectators who had entered the courtroom believing they already understood the story now recognized how easily appearances could shape assumptions long before evidence had the opportunity to speak. Even the reporters revised their summaries once again, ensuring that every published account would reflect verified facts rather than early impressions. Judge Whittaker then delivered a measured statement that resonated throughout the silent courtroom. She observed that the legal system achieved its greatest purpose not when it confirmed what people expected to be true, but when it possessed the discipline to correct itself after new evidence emerged. She officially directed that the court record be amended to incorporate every certified federal exhibit, every verified communication, and every authenticated procedural finding introduced during the hearing. The original narrative that had seemed so convincing only hours earlier had now been replaced by a complete factual record supported through lawful documentation. As the afternoon sunlight gradually filled the courtroom through the tall windows, no one celebrated and no one argued. Instead, there was only a shared understanding that truth had quietly accomplished what assumptions never could. Without dramatic confrontation or raised voices, the hearing had become a reminder that fairness depends not upon confidence, reputation, or first impressions, but upon the patient willingness to follow verified evidence wherever it ultimately leads. The final session concluded with the same quiet dignity that had gradually transformed the entire day. Judge Eleanor Whittaker reviewed the complete record one last time before thanking everyone present for their professionalism and commitment to the judicial process. She noted that the court had benefited from careful testimony, properly authenticated federal documentation, and the willingness of every participant to place verified facts above early assumptions. She emphasized that justice depended upon patience as much as procedure because the truth often arrived one document, one question, and one careful review at a time. With the official findings now preserved in the court record, she declared the hearing concluded. The courtroom slowly returned to motion as attorneys gathered their files, jurors organized their notes, deputies assisted with routine responsibilities, and reporters quietly prepared accurate summaries based upon the evidence rather than speculation. Naomi Carter collected her leather portfolio exactly as she had carried it into the courthouse that morning. Nothing about her movement suggested triumph or resentment. She simply thanked the court respectfully, acknowledged the federal representatives beside her, and prepared to leave with the same calm confidence that had never once abandoned her throughout the proceedings. Officer Daniel Mercer remained seated for a brief moment after the hearing ended, thoughtfully reviewing the official record resting before him. The events of the day replayed quietly in his mind, not as a story of accusation, but as a lesson in the limits of first impressions. He understood that every decision made by a law enforcement officer carried enormous responsibility, and that complete understanding sometimes arrived only after every available fact had been carefully examined. As he stood, he looked toward Naomi. Their eyes met briefly across the nearly empty courtroom. Neither spoke. No apology was requested. No dramatic exchange was necessary. The silence itself reflected a shared understanding that the legal process had fulfilled its purpose by allowing evidence rather than assumptions to determine the outcome. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sky had completely cleared. The rain clouds that had covered the city earlier that morning had disappeared, replaced by warm sunlight reflecting across the broad stone steps leading toward the busy streets of Washington, District of Columbia. Government employees continued walking between offices, tourists admired the historic buildings, and ordinary life moved forward without realizing what had quietly unfolded inside one courtroom. Naomi walked down the courthouse steps beside the federal representatives before continuing toward the next responsibility waiting beyond the public eye. Her assignment had not ended with the hearing, and she carried herself with the same quiet professionalism that had guided every decision throughout the day. Behind her, Officer Mercer exited the courthouse at a slower pace. He paused briefly near the entrance, watching the city continue its ordinary rhythm before turning toward his own responsibilities with a deeper appreciation for the importance of careful judgment, verified information, and procedural fairness. Judge Whitaker remained inside her courtroom completing the final administrative signatures that would permanently preserve the record exactly as the evidence had established it. No headline could fully capture the most important lesson of the day because the greatest moment had not been the revelation of a federal identity. It had been the willingness of an entire courtroom to replace certainty with truth the moment better evidence appeared. Sometimes justice does not arrive with loud declarations or dramatic victories. Sometimes it enters quietly inside a sealed folder, waits patiently for the proper moment, and reminds everyone that a badge may represent authority, but only truth earns lasting respect. And on that ordinary morning that became unforgettable, the law did not change its face. It simply revealed the one that had been standing there all along.